Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
So my path was a path that you could describe in institutional terms as going from being an academic to being a diplomat to being a businessman to being the president of an NGO. It's pretty dry. What really happened was
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn. What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today we are talking to Ambassador Cameron Munter. He is the CEO and president of the East-West Institute, a non-governmental organization that focuses on conflict resolution. Ambassador Munter has been a career diplomat, serving in some of the most conflict-ridden areas of the globe. He served as ambassador to Pakistan from 2010 to 2012, where he guided U.S.-Pakistani relations through a strained period, including the operation against Osama bin Laden. Previously, he served as ambassador to Serbia, where he negotiated Serbian domestic consensus for European integration and managed the Kosovo independence crisis. Welcome, Ambassador Munter.
Yeah, how are you?
What's your why? What's been your career path and your journey, and why did you choose it? How did you start on a career path to be a U.S. ambassador? That's what we're going to talk about today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here in Jackson and talk about this, and it's not the kind of thing I usually end up doing because the work I do at the East-West Institute is really conflict mediation. It's the kind of thing that where we find a situation where we anticipate that there may be conflict, we try to develop relationships so that we can talk to people and avoid that conflict in the future. But already you can see the elements of here. What are the qualities I'm talking about? Talking to people, that means empathy, right? Trying to figure out what they want in the future is trying to extrapolate what they've done and where they're going. So it takes a certain amount of attention to the kind of person you're talking to, and especially in my case, it's cross-cultural. An academic, to being a diplomat, to being a businessman, to being the president of an NGO. It's pretty dry. What really happened was I was someone who decided I wanted to study literature. I studied it. I got a doctorate in literature and history. I realized I would starve to death if I tried to be a teacher. I took an exam. I became a diplomat. I realized that I like to live in different countries. I like to be with people who are other than myself. And I like, through a sense of collective responsibility, to feel a certain amount of solidarity for those other people, but putting it in the context of certain values that I have. I'm an American patriot. I was glad to represent America overseas and to get inside the world of other people. Now in diplomacy is the art of having the other guy have it your way. You want the other guy to see it. You don't want to force him to do something. That's for the military. You want to convince that person that they want to work with you. So I spent the first half of my career in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia under the communists. And then during the process of trying to unify Europe after the end of communism, I had to get to know a lot of people who were undergoing enormous stress and change in their lives and figure out what they wanted. I was working in the White House in 9/11 and realized after that we were working on very different issues, real issues of conflict, cultural difference, and realizing that it wasn't always possible to find common ground. You had to find out just where you differed. So I went twice to Iraq. I was in Serbia when Kosovo became independent. They burned my embassy down. Went to Pakistan, and I was there during the bin Laden raid. So I spent a lot of time then trying to figure out how do you cope with differences and avoid conflict. What I came away with is this, that if you're going to be a diplomat, you say, how do you get on that path? How do you become ambassador to Pakistan? And I always disappoint students when I tell them, the best thing to study is theater arts. Theater arts. What about international relations? What about economics? Sure, you got to be smart. You got to know that stuff too. But someone who's in theater arts plays a role. And the role you play, because you're representing the United States, is not always your own, and you don't always agree with that role, but you have to do it convincingly. It's not playing a role to be false. The only thing you have is your credibility. So you're talking to people who are different than you, say Pakistanis. You're adopting a role and internalizing it. Sometimes you have to be very bloodless. We used to make a joke that, it's not Tina Turner. What's love got to do with it? It's very reasonable, rational. You have to play a role so that you are not getting excited and you're trying to bring reason into a situation where perhaps people's lives are at stake. So you have to be a good actor. And by actor, you have to be sincere, you have to be skilled, and you have to be empathetic. So I've taken a lot of time explaining that to you, but I hope that gives you an idea where I came from, how I did it, and how I assess it now.
As an ambassador, let's say in Pakistan, making big decisions on people's security and their lives, how are we supposed to interpret that? How are we supposed to know what's really happening? And especially in these days when people aren't even trusting the media.
It's interesting you mentioned the word trust. It's a key issue, both in the work that I did every day, but in the representation of what I did to the United States. The kind of question you asked is the same question I used to get when I went back to Washington. And I would meet with Senator McConnell. I would meet with Congresswoman Pelosi. They would say, why are we supporting you in this? Explain to me what we don't know. How do we do this? And I would say, I need you to be able to have a coherent notion of what we want to achieve. So there's the intellectual element of saying, we have to know what we're talking about. We have to know what we want to do. That takes a certain amount of time and patience, and I hope you'll do it. And you have to trust me that I'm going to be able to explain this to you honestly. I am also going to explain to people who are very different from us, the people who live in Pakistan, why America wants to do this. Now, I can make this up if I want. I would much rather Senator McConnell or Congresswoman Pelosi or President Obama. I would much rather understand what you really want here. So the process here, there's, of course, an intellectual process whereby you say, what's in it for us? We want peace between Pakistan and India. We want to make sure that the terrorists who live in India and in Pakistan, and there are many of them, are not killing American soldiers in Afghanistan. We want to see if American businesses can make money there, if American students can maybe study there and Pakistani students study with us. That is all the things that reasonable countries do with each other.
Right.
You can't do any of it without trust. So the relationship building is the key. All that stuff I was describing to you, all of the pieces of the puzzle about economics and about politics and about relationships of countries, which are in a way abstractions. The real thing you're doing from your heart is trying to figure out, can I trust this guy? And to what extent am I trustworthy to them? You lose your trust, you can't be a diplomat.
So in building trust in these relationships, do you spend time with these people, maybe in their homes, with their families? How do you do that?
Well, you're absolutely right to make it personal. The first thing you do is that imagine you're thinking about Pakistan. You haven't been there, I imagine, and you think about it and you say, what are these people like? They're not quite human for you because you haven't seen them. So imagine what they think when some guy in a suit and tie comes from the United States and they've seen movies and they have all these ideas. I'm the last thing from being a human for them. So how do I make myself human? One thing I do is I eat. I'm a big fan of food diplomacy. I eat what they cook, and if I can stand it, I don't want to lie, but if I can stand it, I'll say, this is the best food I've ever eaten. And they say, you don't mean it. Oh, yeah, I do, Or in another country, they don't drink in Pakistan. It's an Islamic country. But in, say, Serbia, I would say, what do you guys drink with dinner? We have rakia. We have this plum brandy. And I say, how do you drink it? We drink it all at once. I'm with you. In other words, you share their experience. You make yourself human. You try to show them. And what does everyone eats, right? What does everyone do? Everyone involved in sports. We would make sure that, if I was going to go out and take a run or ride a bike, talk to the people there about running and bike. Do they do this kind of thing? And I would say one of the things that really gave me some credit is that I play jazz piano. And so even though relations with Serbia were not that great, I did talk them into making me be the opening act of the Belgrade Jazz Festival in 2008. So that this guy who they think of, the Serbs, think of this guy who's a very remote person who lives in an embassy behind armed guards and all this kind of stuff. Well, he is the guy playing Keith Jarrett on the stage here. It humanizes me. So all these things that I've described, when you say, how do you do it? You try to say, what are the things that are universal? What are the things everyone does? And you do them with them. And if you can show respect, that's the other piece of the puzzle, if you can show respect for their traditions, that is to say, really appreciating a biryani that's cooked in Karachi, which I do, then they say, what a great guy. I mean, maybe I'm not a great guy, but as long as they think so, they're going to be in a position to maybe develop trust with me about all those other things that I, as a representative of the United States, need with them.
How does that trickle down to the population, the relations that you build and the decisions that you make at the top, with Washington and the Pakistani government? How does it trickle down to people that it affects? Well,
there's something that we call public diplomacy, which in the classic era of diplomacy, which is probably a couple hundred years ago, very, quiet diplomacy would take place and the common people wouldn't know anything about it. That's not true anymore. With modern communications, people know about what's going on. People watch on TV when there's a terrorist attack or a cultural event or something that happens. And so you have these ideas about other countries. And believe me, every other country in the world has ideas, right or wrong, about the United States. So you engage with your team of people in an embassy in public diplomacy. And public diplomacy is outreach, trying to make sure that you are, in addition to eating people's breakfasts or enjoying what they like to do as sports or something, simply spending time and discussing with them, showing that you know how to listen as well as talk, showing that you know how to answer the questions they ask about what diplomacy does. So I spent a lot of time in Pakistan, traveling to Rawalpindi or to Lahore or to Karachi, talking with people. I would talk with people in madrasas and mosques. I would talk to people in fields. I would talk to business people at big dinners. So what I was trying to do was twofold: learn a little bit from them, but also to communicate what it is I did every day. But that's only half of the story. I would come back to the United States, and I would also travel around the United States and talk to people who said, why don't we just bomb these guys? They were hiding Osama bin Laden. They're a bunch of Islamic fanatics, and they're terrible people, and I say, look, there are people, I'm sorry to say, who probably say the same thing about the United States. You don't need to do that. Let's talk about who these people really are. Let's talk about what our goals are, what we want to achieve. Let's, once again, humanize them, show respect for them in their difference, and figure out where we have common ground. And so even though I can't say that I reached, everyone in the United States, I considered it part of my job to communicate what we were trying to do, to try to build what we thought was going to be peace, stability, and mutual respect among countries in the region, which was the American goal there. And if people bought it, great. And if people didn't buy it, I did my best.
How does the Republican and Democratic differences play in the international, what do you want to say?
The arena,
The arena, yeah. Instead of, here it's very obvious, it's healthcare, it's all those domestic issues. But how does it play out?
Yeah, in terms of image, it's a very interesting proposition. I would sometimes be asked when I was overseas, what's the difference between a red state and a blue state, for example? And I would say, as I understand it, when you live in a red state, you live among people who are like you, and you have a sense of community, and you like it that way. When you're in a blue state, you live among people who aren't like you, and you have a community, and you like it that way. And that's the difference, in a general cultural sense, in a simple way, between America, but they're all Americans. And even if you're a blue state guy and you spend time with red state Americans, you're all Americans. Now, you can like different football teams. You can vote for different people, but ultimately, there are things in common. Many people in recent years, especially in the last year, have questioned whether we have that sense of community, whether we have that sense of commonality. I don't question that. I think we do. And I've traveled a lot in this country. I've served, for example, in Iraq in the middle of a war with a lot of soldiers from places like Tennessee and Kentucky who were pretty amazed to be out there getting shot at with a guy who's a blue state Californian, right? But the fact is, we're all Americans, and whether we are different in what we appreciate about our cultures, there's pretty much consistency. So even though these things are very difficult things in modern social media, for example, the fact that people tend to hear what they want to hear, or they tend to hear news that reinforces what they think, and these kinds of tendencies, despite all that, I think there's an enormous sense of common values in very general sense and common feeling among Americans. Compare that to a place like Pakistan, where the people who live in Punjab don't speak the same language as the people who speak in Sindh or in Pakhtunkhwa. So you have these people who really can't talk to each other. We may have a lot of differences, but what holds us together as a nation, not only of people, but of values, is still much stronger than most other people in the world are fortunate enough to have.
That's excellent.
May I add one thing, though?
Okay.
That you can't take that for granted. That is to say, it does take an effort, especially because those of us who, I live in New York City. So it's a little easier for me. I can stand on any street corner and I'll see a Russian, a Jamaican, a Pakistani, and a Frenchman, and they're all Americans, right? I can do that in New York. It's easy. It's harder when you're in more homogeneous places. You don't tend to see people who aren't like you. Nonetheless, when I meet someone who comes from, say, Kansas, and lives in a town where everyone's white, and we share an experience, it's all what I was talking about when I said what I would do in Pakistan. You can figure out these people. You can make them human. You can figure out what they care about. And ultimately, they do care about what you care about.
What do you share with young people? What do you think that they should be thinking about these days and what's going on, not just globally, but in our nation? Mm-hmm. And how do you advise them to learn and pay attention?
Well, there's one thing that worries me, and that is that there seems to be a sense of, I'll put it in the word individualism, I guess, that seems very pronounced. And one of the things that was very powerful for me when I was a young diplomat is that I was able to go to Poland under communism, and you remember the name of the movement that was there at that time. It was called Solidarity. And solidarity is sympathy for someone who is not like you. That is to say, the suffering of someone else is my own suffering. Now, this comes in many cases from a certain ethical background. It can come from a certain Christian background, but it's not unique to us. It's something that I think is very important. So having solidarity for those who are not like you, having sympathy for those who are poorer than you or who are less fortunate than you, and having an understanding of difference while appreciating it is a very important issue for me, kind of personally. And it was reinforced by what happened to me in my career. I sense that we're having a little difficulty with that now in the United States. That solidarity with people who are not like you. You know, I have kids. My kids say, oh, that guy's a moron. Yeah, okay, maybe he's a moron, but why is he being a moron? You know, dismissing people out of hand is something that I think is easier in an age of social media. And I think that it's something you have to try, and to your question, what do I try to tell people to do? I say take the extra time to humanize someone with whom you may disagree, to try to figure out why that person or that group or those people might act that way, even if what they're doing is reprehensible. Now, look, I'm not a pacifist or a relativist who just says everything's okay. If you find out that someone, after you really make the effort, that someone is really doing things that are just ethically and morally repugnant, you should say so. But you shouldn't say it till you've really tried to figure out why they're doing it, what motivates people to do the kind of things that they do. You at least get some sort of window into a mindset that's not your own, and that's what solidarity is. There's a phrase they use in Polish that is called "nie ma wolności bez solidarności." There can be no freedom without solidarity. And what that means is the freedom that we all value and that we talk about all the time carries with it a certain responsibility that you feel for the other, that you have some notion about other people. Otherwise, freedom is license, freedom is selfishness. And so if you want to have the kind of understanding of your world where you can do things with other people, achieve something more than just what you want, I would say pay attention to the freedom that you have. Don't lose the solidarity that you need to have.
Is our freedom of speech at stake here in this country?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that what we have, again, I would put it more, there's a million ways to speak now. Anyone can write a response to a tweet. There's many, many more opportunities to communicate than they ever had before. And a lot of people 20 years ago, 15 years ago would have said, oh, this is the opening of a new age in which everyone's going to get along, Hasn't happened. But those opportunities are still there. You'll have free speech. The issue is, are you going to have the ability to listen? Listening in a lot of ways is a lot more important than speaking. Are you able to hear what other people say? Can you work on that? And free speech can ultimately be under threat if people don't know how to listen to each other. But listening takes tolerance.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like your career path and your passion as an ambassador has been human relations.
Absolutely. And, who isn't? Maybe yours in broadcasting has been the same as mine. I am currently working for a nonprofit, a privately funded nonprofit that goes out to different parts of the world and tries to anticipate where there are crises and get people to talk to each other who don't normally do that. I go to China. I go to Russia. We have an office in Brussels. We have opening an office in Turkey. Now we do a lot in the Middle East. So that this human relations is something, in my case, that I believe is very important to do with people who are very much culturally different from me.
Right.
That's important. But it's no less important at home. What you learn in the way a family gets along at Thanksgiving is the same kind of stuff that I'm doing sitting down at a table with a bunch of Russians.
It sounds like a great journey.
It sure is.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.